My name is Lori Reyes-Sanchez, and I'm Director of Operations for Busboys and Poets Books. And it is my honor tonight to be able to introduce you all to two incredible authors, both of whom wrote kind of about the same thing, but not really, and are now kind of coming together to really talk more in depth about them. What is that? Do you think I'm talking about? Desire. And we'll get more into it with Luke Burgis and Natasha Dukovsky. And without further ado, I'm going to get off stage and we'll get started.
Thank you so much, Lori. It's so good to be here for, I think it's both of our first in-person event. Exciting after a long 18 months of writing and publishing books. I think it's probably best to start with a little backstory of why Natasha and I are doing this together. Very grateful that she's here as a conversation partner. She read an amazing book. The way that I learned about Natasha's book was we, unbeknownst to us at the time, we had the wonderful new beauty editor at Coverage World magazine reviewing both of our books. And she was thinking about writing a review of Natasha's book and was reviewing mine for possible inclusion in the magazine. And I reached out to Amma, the editor, and I asked her how things were going. And she said, you know, Luke, I happen to have this other book that I'm looking at right now that is amazing, beautifully written, and wow, there are so many connections to your book. It's blowing my mind. And I'm thinking about maybe writing something where I can combine the two. So I said, well, she didn't say what the name of the book was. I said, well, what is this mysterious book? And she said, it's the portrait of Amir. You should check it out. So, of course, I impulse bought it on Amazon. Unfortunately, because it wasn't available here at Busboys and Poets. And I devoured it. And I was really blown away by what I read, because Natasha beautifully captured in her book all of the themes that are in my book. And my book is a nonfiction book about the nature of human desire. And Natasha wrote a novel, and her book is just full of the same kinds of ideas and social forces that I try to describe in Wanting. So I reached out to Natasha, and I told her that I'd read her book and a little bit about the backstory, and she read Wanting, and then the two of us had, it's like the coolest thing that can happen for an author. The two of us are like going back and forth with each other. Oh my gosh, I just read this part of your book, and I read this part of your book. And we kept seeing these connections until we both finished. And she's just the perfect conversation partner, so I'm really glad you're here.
Oh, thank you so much. And I almost think that you just have to dive in to give the reader a sense of how similar our two works are. So I don't know if you want to, but we should just dive in with a couple of excerpts of our two books in parallel.
Sure, yeah. So
I think we gotta do it.
Let's do it. So Natasha was keeping, we were both keeping notes. I don't have my hard copy of your book with me, but I have notes all over the place. And we compared direct passages in our books that line up strikingly well. So
you want to read the top part? I'll read the bottom.
Sure, let's do it. So we'll read, so what I read is from my book, and what Natasha reads is from the portrait of Amir. The simplest definition of love is wanting what's good for another.
He wanted to embrace her, yes, but not because he wanted to embrace her. He wanted to embrace her because it was what he truly, deeply felt that she wanted, because it was the only thing he could think to do to comfort her. Had Dale been more readily acquainted with this disorienting sensation, he might have properly identified it as love.
My phone's not working, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Here we go. So this is from Wanting. But their real victory comes not when they have authority over people's actions, speaking about authoritarian rule. Rather, their victory comes when they have authority over people's desires. They don't want to keep prisoners in cells. They want those prisoners to learn to love themselves. When there is no desire for change, their authority is complete.
A prison, certainly, but the kind of prison you would choose. A prison with an Instagrammable view.
Two houses, both alike in dignity, from Shakespeare, yet they hate each other. The tiniest provocation has the potential to incite contagious violence that makes the families more alike, even as they think of themselves as more different.
But then again, nothing highlights difference quite like homogeneity. Last one.
The Egyptians may have associated the attitude of cats with various divinities because of the cat's apparent lack of desire. Who is less needy than a god?
The ultimate act of power isn't getting what you want, but rather sacrificing it willingly. Because that is an act of power over yourself, of power over power. And what kind of moral has that? So maybe with, this kind of gives a broad definition, not a broad definition, but an introduction to the types of themes that are in our books. But Luke, maybe you could start out by giving just a broad definition of mimetic desire and what you mean by mimesis and mimetic theory.
Sure, and I'd love, so the theme of my book, Wanting, to sum up, is human desire. What is desire, and what is the nature of it? How does it work? I'd love, after I can take a stab at this one, Tasha, I'm curious as to how you would sum up the theme of your book.
Yeah.
Mine is definitely desire. So before I explain what mimetic desire is, let's just start with desire. Desire is not something that we think about a whole lot. We just kind of take it for granted, right? We want things because we want it. And desire is kind of it's a human faculty of the will. When we desire something, we move towards it. So one way that I would describe desire is it sort of causes movement. When we desire, we act. When there's no desire, there's no action, there's no movement. So we can sort of desire something and then move or act to bring that thing into being. It's what draws us closer to things, draws things nearer to us. So, in the case of Busboys and Poets, they have really, really good, fried chicken here. When I desire that, I draw near to it, or to a cake, or to whatever, new pair of shoes that I want. I'm intentionally wearing my Chuck Taylors here because they're one of the funniest examples of desire, and I'll explain why, right? There's not a lot of objective reasons why I would want to wear these shoes. They're not even that comfortable. But this gets really interesting in the movements between people. We draw near to certain people. There's like this mysterious attraction that certain people have over us, and it's not very well understood. So my book was trying to get at the heart of what is desire and how and why does it move us. I drew my inspiration for the book from a French thinker named René Girard, who was a historian by training and came to the U.S. shortly after World War II, and sort of got thrown into teaching a bunch of subjects that he wasn't trained in. He got thrown into teaching classic literature, was among them. And in his study of classic literature, I started to notice something really mysterious about the way that desire is portrayed in some classic literature, some of the greatest literature of all time. And what he noticed was that the characters in these novels don't spontaneously, autonomously desire anything. Rather, their desire is always formed and generated through another character in the novel, which he calls a model of desire. And if you pay really close attention to the characters in those novels, you see how that they're being sort of manipulated in a sense. Sometimes intentionally, many times unintentionally, by other characters in the books. And if you know who the models of desire are, their actions begin to make a lot more sense. And you can almost follow the desire through the book by knowing who the models are. You kind of gain insight into why the characters are behaving the way that they behave. So Girard spotted this in literature and began to then see how this applies to our everyday lives. And the reason that these characters in these novels are so real to us is because that's the way that desire actually works. So when I'm using the word desire, I'm not referring to, let's say, some of our base needs or base desires, like the things that we have biological wiring for. Like if I'm dying of thirst in the desert, I don't require a model of desire to show me that what I want is a glass of water. Okay? If I'm freezing cold, I don't require a model of desire to show me that I'm icy warm. But after this kind of basic level of needs and desires, I wouldn't even call those desires at all, actually. I would just call those needs. We move into this realm of more abstract things. And for these abstract things, I don't have any kind of physiological basis for wanting, Chuck Taylor All-Star shoes, right? It's funny, like everybody wears them, really cool, but like I have models of desire for these shoes and for a lot of other things that I desire in my life, from, sort of the way I want to be as an author to career choices, to fashion and ideas and politics. And gaining some sense of awareness of who my models are is kind of the first step in sort of understanding what's really motivating me and what's attracting me to certain people and certain things. So the book really kind of unpacks all of the implications of that one fundamental insight of my joy.
Yeah. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading your book and learning that some of these ideas of Girard's were pretty old and been around for a while, I could not fathom, because it seems so fundamental to me, and so much of my own work has been based on some of the insights. It felt, I tell people, like you gave me a vocabulary for something I had been immersed in and didn't realize that other people had been thinking about too. And I'm wondering if you have a sense of why more people aren't talking about Girard. It seems like such a basic, fundamental thing that is at the core of what makes us human, at the core of what makes characters in literature seem human. It's not that they want the same things we do, but that they want how we want with that mediation. Why do you think that this hasn't gained broader appreciation sooner?
I have some ideas, and I'm happy to share them. So you were an undergrad English major, correct?
I was an undergrad English major. I read many of the works that Girard most admires, steeped in them. I took more English classes than was required. One of the reasons I went to the university I went to was because I didn't want to have to take any math or science classes. So I was steeped in the humanities, the broad-based humanities that Girard was clearly thinking about looking at. Never heard of them.
And you wrote your book, which for me was shot through with these, mimetic desire, really.
Yeah.
Yet you had just intuited this phenomenon without having actually had a name to call it by. Is that right?
Yeah, it's the same way that I think we've talked about how Girard came across his idea as well from personal experience and observation and watching people interact with each other, watching yourself interact with other people. And so I think it's a fairly intuitive concept. That said, reading your book was, felt like Cassandra being believed. Having the vocabulary itself, I think, is so helpful, but it really did shock me that it's not something I came across before. You asked about my, themes, and I do consider The Portrait of Lumiere to be first and foremost a thematic novel, and I was basing the book on a thematic architecture, including recursion, mythology, innovation, and glamour. And the Mimesis is actually kind of one of my connectors that connects
version and mythology, and I was interested in this stuff, right? Like I was looking for it, and I didn't find it.
Right. Yeah, I still feel like Cassandra, by the way. Even now that I've read the book, it still very much feels like that. Well, and I have to say, your book is about two couples who become entangled in there's a couple separate, without getting too much away, sort of love triangles. I think it's okay.
I would call it more of a love square.
A love square.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm reading that. I haven't read a book in a very long time. I mean, aside from the classic novels that Gerard was describing, that had such mimetic characters that were sort of driven through mimetic desire. And I didn't answer your question, but just to be totally clear about what mimetic desire is, that Natasha really captures powerfully in her book. Most of us realize that imitation plays a really important role in our culture. This is how babies learn language. It's kind of the foundation of education and learning. Human beings are the most imitated creatures in the world, and it's what allows us to build technology. We build on the shoulders of giants. Imitation is really important. It's really important for writers too. I think hopefully we get to this later, but Natasha and I both have models of writers, brilliant writers, and we are intentional about trying to imitate them in various ways. Gerard's insight is that we typically think of imitation as the imitation of art or style or external superficial factors. But Gerard realized that imitation also goes down to root desires of human beings, and that we intuit the desires of other people, and that we imitate their very desires, and that this shapes our perception about how valuable a certain career path is, about, unfortunately, about the worth of certain people even. So this happens in romance all the time. You can run into another person and maybe not feel any sense of attraction to that person. But if the right model of desire comes along for that person, all of a sudden it changes your desire. And it can happen in a split second, right? And this is where things get really complicated in human relationships, right? Because we don't often realize that usually the models are hidden. We like to tell ourselves certain stories about why we desire things in people, but we don't, and usually that involves some hyper-objective, hyper-rational explanation, right? And we don't admit that we're these social creatures that are heavily influenced by what other people want. There's a few reasons why I think Gerard is not well known, and why I think people aren't talking about Gerard. Why, in the academy, in academia, I think one of the things that hurt him is that he became religious, and I think that he also had, he was kind of like out of step with the typical way of doing literary criticism in the 60s. I think that was kind of a mark against him within the university system.
So would you say that his anti-mimetic tendencies with regard to literary criticism were a competitive disadvantage for him?
Huge disadvantage for him, right? Huge disadvantage. So there are advantages to being mimetic and to going along with the crowd when the crowd pays your salary, right? And when the crowd is responsible for your job. And Gerard bucked a lot of those things. And one of the reasons I say that I think his religion cost him is he became a Christian, and after his first couple of books, he wrote his first couple of books, and they were acclaimed in France and in the United States. And then his third book, all of a sudden, was after he had had this experience, and nobody paid any attention. So there's pretty good evidence that had something to do with it. Number two, he was obscure and it's hard to read. He is not easy to read.
I've noticed this.
Yeah.
Your book is a lot easier to read than Gerard's.
It's why I wrote the book. After having read his books 5 times each, I was like, wow, it's taken me a lot of effort to do this, and I think I could add some value by translating this and relating it to modern life. Number 3, I think he was very hard to categorize. You know, no one discipline could kind of claim him as their own. So he was trained in history, his doctorate was in history. He taught literature, he wrote about literature, he wrote about theology. He was a social theorist, so sociology for sure, psychology. So you have all of these colleagues who are like, well, what is he? You know, literary critics are like, what do we call him? He was certainly one of the most interdisciplinary thinkers that I've run across in a very, very long time. And I think people really want to be able to just put a label on somebody when they can't do that.
It's such a shame. It's so limiting. You know, I think that interdisciplinary studies finally gain some ground, but even still, to reach true expertise in academic circles, the degree of specialization that's required, I think actually inhibits the kind of insights at the scale that Girard is making with the idea of mimetic desire and mimetic theory. And the whole piece that he goes off into lots of different areas. So that's the time to discuss today, but you have to read the book to learn about scapegoats and many other kind of related phenomena.
Yeah, so Girard was what Isaiah Berlin called a hedgehog. He said there were sort of two kinds of thinkers. There are foxes and there are hedgehogs. And the foxes know many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And in that sense, René Girard was a hedgehog because he had one insight, and it was really the mimetic nature of desire, that desire is imitative. And if that's true, then desire is everywhere. And you have no choice but to kick the tires in different domains of life. And he did, he certainly did. So it's hard to talk about his work without bringing in a lot of different things, which is why the book was hard to write, right? Without being too much all over the place. I tried to pick a narrative theme, and for me, it was business because my background is as an entrepreneur. We share that a little bit. We have surprisingly similar backgrounds, actually.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, I trained as a strategist in MBA, not in MFA, so pretty unusual for novelists.
Right. So you're I'm curious about the book. I mean, can you speak a little bit about how intentional you were in terms of this theme of mimesis? You call it recursion, right?
Well, I think that mimesis and recursion are different. When I was thinking of mimesis, I was thinking of it in kind of the Eric Auerbach traditional literary sense that I was taught as an undergrad, which really is the specific literary context of the imitation of reality in art. So I was very interested in that with my book and capturing a realistic mimetic, specifically low mimetic tone to the novel in the vein of some of the greats, Jane Austen and Henry James, Edith Wharton, right? But I was even more interested in recursion. So what I would say is the thing that interests me most is the mimesis of mimesis. So when mimetic desire or mimetic anything really takes off. So the Chuck Taylors are a great example of this, right? It's not that one person is copying the second with the Chuck Taylors and has a monomaniacal obsession with one person and it ends there. I'm very interested in how the Chuck Taylors get picked up by one person that then gets picked up by another person and another person and another person. You get these embedded layers of self-similar repetition. And in terms of my book, The Narcissus Myth is the perfect example of this because in art you have in the Caravaggio on the painting, you have a painting within a painting, and you the viewer then become an echo, which ties into the story of Narcissus. So it's both mimetic and recursive, and the two powers combined, I think, is where it gets really interesting. And from a business standpoint,
most kind of relevant to our world today with how much algorithms are driving our lives, and that recursion is the underlying computer science phenomenon that's belying a lot of these algorithms, and whether we want to admit it or not, driving the decisions that we make even when we don't realize it is. So, you talk a lot about social media in your book as well, and I think that tying the business threads and the mimesis and recursion together with our modern world, the two phenomena are working together in really devastatingly powerful ways.
Well, I agree, and that connection between mimetic desire and recursion is important. So if you ask me, who is my model of desire to wear chucks, I can't name one, right? I mean, I could go back to my earliest memories. It's not like there was one person that wore them that, it's almost like the recursion had already happened. And it's like this amorphous, desire being modeled to me that these are cool shoes to wear.
Well, that's also one of the inherent kind of properties of infinite recursion, or mimesis paired with recursion, we could say, is that a human being can only process 5, 6, maybe 7 layers of recursion before you get instability of meaning. So chucks had proliferated well beyond that before you probably would have come into contact with them.
Yeah. I'll try not to date myself. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Well, I think that's right, and why this is so important, this mimesis and recursion, and after a certain point, you sort of lose track of things. I speak about in the book. There are cycles of desire that we can be caught up in, and it can be recursive, and it can lead us down dark paths when we don't realize the forces that are acting on us. And I think that mimesis and recursion are responsible for everything from the political polarization that we see to why it feels like we live in a post-truth world sometimes. Because as you said, right, at a certain point, you're not able to keep track of these things anymore. And meaning begins to disintegrate.
Yeah, and the echo, it's frequently with the political polarization, you hear talks about the echo chamber, and we live in these bubbles of all of our own ideas, literally being programmed to be spit back at us, so that we buy things that that our desires have been modeled for.
Sure, and the scary part about an algorithm is that the big tech companies are deeply concerned with what our desires are and are actively taking steps to shape those desires. And whether they know the term mimetic desire or not, they seem to have intuited very deeply, kind of the social nature of desire and program that directly into their algorithms.
So I have to ask this question here because I had a question, I think it's so closely related to this, because you devote a bunch of time in wanting to talking about people who have hacked mimetic desire. I'm thinking particularly of your discussion of Peter Thiel when you met him. To what extent do you think understanding mimetic desire, as opposed to for Girard, where kind of the opposite happened, can be a material competitive advantage rather than a disadvantage? And to what extent should it be? Is there an ethical issue here? And might it be possible that folks that have kind of intuited mimetic desire and taking steps to be anti-mimetic, can being anti-mimetic turn into its own kind of mimetic competition? Is there really any way to escape?
Yeah, so that's a big question.
Yes.
Let me figure out where to start. So in the book, I talk about some people that have, seem to have hacked mimetic desire. Eddie Bernays was one who is kind of considered, the father of modern day public relations. Peter Thiel, who's the co-founder of PayPal, describes the reason that he initially invested in Facebook as a realization that Facebook would be a generator of massive amounts of mimetic desire. And Peter Thiel, by the way, was a student of Rene Girard when he was at Stanford. And that would seem to imply that he was able to hack this insight into mimetic desire to make billions of dollars as the first investor in Facebook. But I don't think that one can hack mimetic desire really. And if you think that you are, at the end of the day, the joke is probably on you. Sure, we can, realize that there's mimesis happening in the market and use that to make certain investment decisions, or use it to manipulate people's hearts, if we understand how it works. And then go out and get caught up in just a different form of mimesis of our own. So, the fundamental realization here is that mimetic desire is not something out there. It's not like a technology that's external to us. And if we just understand how it works, then we can use it to get what we want. It's something that's internal to us, right? It's inside of us. And it exists in the relationship between people. And the more that we sort of pridefully think that we've taken ownership of it, or that we understand it, and then we can wield it like a weapon, the more it's probably sort of controlling us, right? It's kind of a rebellion against our own nature itself. So I think that is really a kind of a Promethean follow that we can engage in. And then there's this irony, right, of trying to be anti-mimetic, right? Like thinking of ourselves as hyper anti-mimetic. It's kind of like why, no hipster ever thinks they're a hipster.
I was
right?
just going to say, Brooklyn hipsters have got to be the perfect example of this, right?
Yeah, because it's like being a contrarian. Okay, if you begin to think of your identity as being a contrarian, well, then you're just the most mimetic person of all. Because all you've really done is said, well, let me look at what everybody else is doing, and I'll do the opposite, or I'll think or say the opposite. That's just a form of mere imitation, and it's hyper-mimetic. It's kind of what we would call negative partisanship in politics. It's like, if the left thinks this, then the right can't, or vice versa, right? And we're quite literally like modeling ourselves off of like people that are perceived enemies,
Sure.
and they end up, like choose your enemies wisely because you become like them, and that's kind of the danger of mimesis. So like the more that we try to extract ourselves from it, the irony is that the more we can actually lean into it without even realizing that we're doing it.
Well, and this is interesting you mention that, because while I didn't have the vocabulary for it, I guess the innovation that I was trying to get at in the portrait of Lumiere around mimesis and mimetic desire was that it would be two ways and recursive. So you have so many of the great novels where they reveal the imitative nature of desire, like Girard says, right? But I was setting up each couple's relationship and secondary, alternative relationship as a mimetic rivalry that is, kind of irresolvable and into a kind of four-way mimetic crisis, right? So that everything everyone is reacting to each other, and it just devolves into chaos because of it.
Yeah, well, the book ends wonderfully, I thought, and I won't give anything away, but it really ends wonderfully, and I just think you did a brilliant job. And at certain points, it was one of the reasons. Let me go back to one of the first questions that you asked me. It was, why is Girard not more widely discussed and accepted? And one of the reasons, and perhaps the most important reason, actually, is the self-awareness and the self-criticism that mimetic desire stirs up in the reader. And that happened to me in a good way. I mean this, and there's not a lot of books that can do this, right? That can make you almost uncomfortable as the reader, because you realize that you're caught up in these very things. And I think that the reason that you were able to write so well is that you recognize some of this in yourself.
100%. And you know, we've talked about this, but I think the key to, I'm interested if you think this is true for nonfiction, but for me, the key as I was writing, it took me about a year to figure out what I was doing and find a voice to write fiction. And the key to that was basically surmounting my own ego to write with honesty and look in the mirror and see everything, even if it was uncomfortable and in some cases horrifying, and kind of tell the truth anyway. It's been very interesting to see how that's kind of turned this book and its reception into a very polarizing one. I get, you know, notes that it's their favorite novel they've read in years, and then I also get some just scathing reviews that people really didn't like it, right? And I think that has so much to do with, you know, the mirror aspect. They did want it to be, you know, kind of uncomfortable to look in mirror for the viewer, and you know, people, not everyone wants to see what's there.
No, I mean, was it Franz Kafka? Didn't he say, you might know this line, he said basically like the good novelist has to like take an ice pick like into the reader's like hearts almost, right? And sometimes it's a little uncomfortable.
Well, into your own too, right? Because it's about the shared humanity. It's almost being vulnerable in a sense to the reader and saying, hey, I'm putting out how it really is for, you know, for these characters, for me. You know, maybe even though there's unattractive pieces of it, you will recognize and appreciate its honesty.
Well, I so appreciate the honesty of your book, and in a sense, you know, you've really, what's the best way for me to say this? You know, you've really like based it on thickly in a good sense, right? Like it really is, it evokes like strong emotions. And I, on the other hand, was relatively intentional about trying to not make the reader too uncomfortable.
Well, it's this Seinfeld thing that you mentioned.
So this is a great example, right? So Gerard says that like one of the reasons that Seinfeld is such a great show and so beloved is that it's mimetic through and through, okay? Like if you watch Seinfeld carefully, especially like once you understand what mimetic desire is, everybody's hyper-mimetic in that show. Like one character takes an interest in something and then all of a sudden all the other characters take an interest in it immediately. And they get pulled into these petty rivalries with each other. It's a mimetic show through and through. But it's done in such a way where it doesn't evoke like self-criticism in the viewer. You know, we can just kind of sit there and laugh, and it doesn't implicate us in the silliness of the plot. We can just be like, oh gosh, look at George again, right? And like, hello Newman, you know, and it's over-dramatized, and it's so ridiculous that we don't see it in our own lives. And in a sense, that is the genius of that show, in my opinion. I think it was very intentional.
But it rings true to us because even though, and this is why the realism aspect of mimetic desire and kind of the greatness of it in literature is it's not about it being exactly like life in terms of what they want. It can be overdone. But the mimetic piece of it itself, that Seinfeld mirrors how we want and you know, that it goes through other people. That makes it relatable to us, even if it isn't, you know, photorealistic.
Yeah, I think that's right. And you know, that's the beauty of fiction, right? Is that you can do things like that. And you know, it seemed to me, well, I don't know if it was fun writing the book. I don't know if that's the word.
Parts of it were, yeah, sure.
Because certainly, it seems it's a fun book to read. Because you know, Natasha, one of the things that she does in the book, which, you know, I laughed out loud as I was reading the book because she intersperses text message exchanges into the book, and they're so real to life. My first thought was like, oh, these have to be real text message exchanges that she had. Like, I could never, ever, like, fictionalize a text message exchange that's too good. So there's a lot of elements that are just really fun.
Well, most of them aren't real. I mean, most of them are fictions. There's real novels for them, right?
Sure.
For everything. And, you know, the character of Julia Cox Khadijah for instance, who I think is probably the most of not only likable character in the novels, you know, dead ringer for my late friend Evan, and I was, you know, basically trying to change nothing about him because, you know, really unbelievable people in reality, I think, often make extremely believable, excellent characters.
Yeah, and that's, I think that's such a good point. Like, there are, one of the reasons you know, one of the nice things about doing this with you is like, you wrote fiction and I wrote nonfiction, right? But I aspire, I have the mimetic desire to write fiction someday. I think it's a lot harder. You know, I have some characters in my life that are so like unbelievable. Like, it's like, I can't believe this person exists.
That's who you have to write about.
And I've slotted them away in my memory, and I've like taken some notes to myself, and I can find the right fiction. All I have to do is basically, I don't say anybody's name, but all I have to do is use that person.
So who are your models as a writer?
You know, I think we have different models for different domains of life. You know, we have models of desire for what it means to be a parent, or maybe in our career path. So for me as a writer, I think that as nonfiction, at least, René Girard himself was a model because he was such an interdisciplinary mind and writer, and was able to pull in things, these disparate things, scenes and disparate things, and show how they relate. He's a model for me in that regard. I don't think there are a lot of really, really good interdisciplinary writers out there anymore. We're becoming a lot more siloed. He's not a model for me in terms of the writing style. And hopefully I changed that, and that's one of the things I hope to do is make it readable.
Yeah.
You know, I have others. I think about Walker Percy as a model for me, and what he was able to do. The Moviegoer, Lost in the Cosmos is one of my favorite books. You know, that's a book that really provokes like real existential angst when you're reading it, and that's something that I don't mind doing as a writer, which takes courage to do. You know, and I've been thinking, like, how can I relate some of these ideas of mimetic desire to the world that we live in today, modern day America? And I've asked myself, like, what's my model for doing that? And the only one that I can think of is Jonathan Swift. Because
He's a model for me.
I think you have to almost, because everybody's so serious about it.
Yeah.
You almost have to like do an end around, right? And like catch people by surprise.
I love
that satire. So, what are yours?
So I generally think that when it comes to writing, the more models, the better. If you steal a little bit from everyone, you'll never be a plagiarist. And I really try to steal a little bit from everyone. And there are snippets from so many different books and poems and plays and movies interspersed and interwoven through the Portrait of Vermeer that my editor actually had me add an additional appendix between when the advanced copy and the final copy came out, with many of my anxieties and influence. That said, we all have our strongest models, and for me, my two strongest models are James Joyce and Jane Austen. Joyce is who taught me the very idea of stealing a little bit from everyone, right? Although he, stole extra from Homer, he really was looking at encyclopedic allusions, as he was writing. But again, definitely not a style model for me. One of, as much as I love Joyce's work, I think one of its big problems is that it's just not terribly accessible. He was a genius and really, really pushing the boundaries of literature at the time, but some of his later work approaches, total incomprehensibility. In my opinion, Ulysses kind of is the apex and then goes down. So from a prose standpoint, my model is always will be Jane Austen, and she's eminently readable, snarky, ironic. My father's an English professor, and one of the greatest gifts he ever gave to me was starting to read me her novels when I was in elementary school. And so, her voice is just so deeply embedded in my mind that I joke that she's the voice of my conscience.
Yeah. Well, I think I think we should probably open it up to questions here in a minute. And just to finish off on this, as you were describing your models for writing, I think one of the important points is it's good to have models that we imitate. And mimetic desire can be positive, and it's really important, or it can be negative. And often we have this idea of innovation as we have to be totally unique and we can't imitate anybody. But I think we've both found that innovation can quite naturally happen out of imitation. It just happens.
I would even go so far to say that imitative work tends to be, as long as you're not pulling from too much from one person, so it's an outright copying of plagiarism, I think it often tends to be the fastest path to originality.
I agree. So there are times to be mimetic, and there are times to be anti-mimetic. Is one thing I would kind of leave off with here. We want to be mimetic and have positive mimetic desires stirred up in us. When we encounter some beautiful model in the world, right? Some model of charity, some virtue, some model of what it means to be a good neighbor or a loving mother or father. I want to be stirred up and have a mimetic desire to see that. There are other times when we do need to be anti-mimetic. And to go a little biblical here, I think like the most powerful example of that is the idea of, if you're kind to those who are kind to you, and you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? It's really hard to be kind to those who dislike you, to love those who hate you. And that is, in my opinion, kind of the supreme example of being anti-mimetic, not returning anger for anger, and thinking of it as justice, right? And that's the kind of anti-mimetic thing that I'm really, even if I didn't say it like that, well, that's kind of where it all ends for me. And that's really hard.
And plus, if you don't choose your models proactively, then your subconscious is going to choose them for you. It's not you. There's no getting around it.
Yeah.
So you might as well, reach for those positive
The intention. Well, Natasha, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Are there any questions?
I guess I had a question. I mean, I came in late, so I don't really know. I never heard of mimetic desire or even heard of that terminology. But I mean, like, are you actually able to be free of mimetic desire given the society in which we're born in, and we're constantly fed everything that we even desire to this point? So how do you even know if we have an original thought or original desire or any of those things? Because at this point, everything has been breastfed. And is it even like, and at that point, is it even wrong to have a mimetic desire? Because to your point, some of that could be good. I mean, and that's absolutely okay. Especially if you want to help, if you want to buy those Chuck Taylors or whatever, like, do it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I certainly, that's a great question. And, I would say strongly that, we can't transcend the mimetic desire. It's part of who we are. It's part of what it means to be human. And it's a beautiful thing. It means that we are relational creatures. We're always in relationship. We're social. And love itself is mimetic. It works in that beautiful way. So the real key, I think, is just being conscious and aware of who our models are, positive or negative.
I think you mentioned something interesting at the beginning there, though, around how inescapable it is today, right? So I think that there is a piece where we're definitely not going to be able to transcend it, but understanding that social media and online life in general that defines our age is deliberately hacking our human operating system for this, what can be a beautiful thing, but from Facebook's standpoint is also like a money-making vulnerability. Like understanding that does help us to resist And I do think that it is important to, knowing that we can never get rid of it entirely, put, as much as we can, put limits around those things, because between the surveillance, I mean, the surveillance economy is mining this, this tendency as the, as the raw material of late capitalism.
Yeah, it reminded me of another good book, Surveillance Capitalism.
So that's a great book, right? Shoshana Zuboff, yeah.
It's a great book. Yeah, I mean, I feel like we're free to make certain choices, to protect ourselves from the negative mimesis, or to lean into the positive kind. I'm free to, shut off the news when it's toxic. I'm free to put up boundaries with social media. But, freedom is something that I feel can be won or lost, right? If I wait too long to do certain things, I become less free to take that action. And I can also gain freedom too, so.
So at that point, I mean, so what you were guys talking about, like, so then that means that self-awareness is like the most paramount thing, because I had to even ask myself this question prior to even mimetic knowledge. I didn't know any of this. But like asking yourself those questions, I was just like, do I want to have a child because society says I should have a child? Or do I desire a child? Do I actually want to have a child because I want to have this child? Or is it because of that Hollywood, fictional fairy tale?
This is so interesting to me because children and marriage, I think, are some of the most mimetic things that we do. You see groups of friends all getting married at the same time, all having children at the same time. The summer I got married, I had like 5 weddings in 6 weeks to go to, including my own. Like, it's not an accident, it's mimetic desire at work. 4 of my 5 best friends from high school were pregnant at the same time. Wow. It really happens all the time. Like huge life decisions that you think you're making independently, it's a really, really important question to ask yourself. And you may never really know, right? Because particularly, I think it's tough with marriage and children too, because they are also biological, like need kind of level impulses. So the line is really, I'm interested what you have to say.
Yeah, isn't the novel Their Eyes Are Watching God, isn't it basically about this very question, right? About the societal influences on marriage. So I think it's both. And one of the things that I write about in the book is the difference between, this is just my term, thin desires and thick desires. So, a thin desire would be like a socially derived desire that, might be highly mimetic. And a thick desire is more reflective of, your core identity, like something that has always been with you, has been formed in your family, and it's like a desire that you've really cultivated. And being able to discern the difference between a thin desire and a thick desire, I think is part of how we can begin to answer the question, like, why am I doing this, right? Why do I want to have kids, or why do I want to move to the city, or whatever it is? That's a skill, and I don't think we're born with that skill, and I certainly don't think we're taught that skill in school. But it's one that I wish was like part of education, is like that skill of basic discernment.
Particularly since this is kind of another thing. Marriage and kids happen later, and there's such big things that I think follow the mimetic patterns. But you mentioned school, and another thing that kind of came to mind with wanting is how extra susceptible adolescents and teenagers are to mimetic desire. And as much as we're as adults still so susceptible, that there's something about that. Have you studied or seen anything about this? Because I can remember back to being a teenager, and some of these impulses to be like your friends, to follow the group were even much stronger.
I think adolescence is like the hyper-mimetic time of anybody's life. Like everybody's first model of desire is their parents, one of their parents, and then maybe an older sibling. And then we reach a certain point where all of a sudden they have a bunch of new models for the first time. And we realize that our parents aren't gods, and other people look worthy of imitation, and then we kind of reject our parents because they're not cool anymore, which is itself like a So, there's so much going on right there. If there was like one, and this is why I think like it's important for parents, to understand. It's a lot for kids to understand this, right? But I wonder, as hopefully a parent of a child today, what can I do to actually help my child, like, not have so much of that anxiety that comes from the constant measuring against all of their peers, which they're all.
Man, if you find out, let me know. Before I quit there.
Luke, I know you said that you wrote that the purpose of your book was for business, and is that you said was writing?
It's actually not. I happen to have told more business stories in the book because it's where I come from.
Okay.
But the purpose of the book is certainly not for business people. It's for anybody.
And so, but you also mentioned that, the book isn't towards understanding this so you can monopolize on it, right? So what is the core purpose of the book?
I think the core purpose of the book is helping people to enter into healthy relationships, right? Relationships that are not driven solely by mimesis and by mimetic rivalry, because mimetic desire very often leads to viewing other people as a threat or something. So human beings are intensely focused on others and what other people want, and this affects relationships dramatically. And we can take our knowledge of this to affect other people in positive or negative ways. So let me give you an example, a very concrete example of how this works. My wife Claire is sitting right there in the audience. At a certain point, I wanted Claire to take an interest in me, okay, when we first met. And I wanted to nudge her in the direction of thinking that I'm an okay guy, Now, how can I do that, right? And this is, think business here as I'm saying this, right? Because this has to do with, the CEO of a company. How do you want to acquire, clients, for instance? Well, there's two major ways that people can cultivate desire in another person, right? We can
Please talk about the pickup artist here.
Yeah. So we can do it in, I was actually. So we can do it in a coercive or manipulative way, okay? Which to the person on the other end of it feels like pushing back, right? It feels like they're being forced into something. Or they can be driven by fear, which we can instill in them ourselves, like, well, if you're not with me, you're just going to be alone for the rest of your life or something. So people are very manipulative, and there's been a book written about this called Pickup Artists, about a group of really terrible men that basically employ psychological tactics to pick up women. So that's one way. The other way would be to enter into that relationship of desire. And of course I want her to desire me, right? That's because I desire her. But to do it in a way that is more of just like a subtle kind of like beckoning, right? Which to the person, being acted upon feels more just like a subtle, gentle, loving tug from the shirt rather than pushing them back. I don't know if I succeeded in doing that, but like that's the way that I want to approach relationships with people. If I desire that they desire something, okay, I want to work on that, respecting their freedom, respecting their autonomy and their will, and not imposing mine on them in any way. And that applies just as much in my romantic relationships as the other hat that I wear as a business person. And unfortunately, I don't think that that's the way that a lot of business leaders view client acquisition, for instance.
All right. Thank you all so much. Let's go ahead and give them a round of applause. And this is me. Let me actually get on screen because I'm seeing. Hello, everyone. So that does conclude the end of our live stream. We're going to actually keep the conversation going because it seems like y'all have some really good points, which is amazing. Thank you all for joining us tonight. If you would like to purchase a signed copy of either this lovely book, Wanting, The Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life, or alternatively, The Portrait of a Mirror, a novel. You can get those here at 14th and D, Busboys and Poets, or buy them online with shipping included on Eventbrite. Just go ahead to the event page for this one, and you'll get hooked up, no problem. All right, and you can do it. A little bit of excitement never hurt anyone. Anything before we head off for the night, guys?
Just thank you to Natasha, thank you to Busboys and Poets. It's such a pleasure to be in person with you all and to talk about our books.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for having us. It's a pleasure.